Right, Ian, it's your turn to contribute. Ian is a social anthropologist. He teaches at this university. He's very experienced, particularly interested in community matters, the way museums could be used to advance community understanding of issues, and he has experience of having worked in museums in Namibia. So over to you.
Okay, thanks. Well, racism, xenophobia, religious persecution, all these kind of various philosophies that justify human mistreatment of other humans on the grounds of difference have been around forever, as far as we know. They don't need museums to propagate them. However, they have used museums. And the forms of scientific racism that we're more familiar with today have developed a disturbing relationship with museums, which has to do with the museum's claim to be able to represent the other. This is the kind of thinking that's tied up, as Sam said, with the colonial missionary enterprise of spreading so-called civilization among the savages, for which we can read inferior races. It's obviously a racist way of thinking. A close relative of this is the kind of modern euphemism of culturalism, the belief that some forms of culture are more advanced, read superior, to others. The kind of thinking that allows people to say things like Islamic societies are not democratic, or African leaders are corrupt. I think that's racism still. These ideas, the fact that people sitting in Western or European museums or parliaments can say those kind of things, is all tied up with the development of what we might call a scientific way of thinking that emerged in Europe at the time of what we call the European Enlightenment, which, frankly, its timeline is about an inch from the end. So which shows how important it really is. Museums, however, are both products and producers of this way of thinking. They're products of this kind of scientific thought that divides the world up and organises it into categories. They began as what were called cabinets of curiosities in kind of 17th century rich homes. And even so, even though these things were kind of disorganised, they didn't have classification systems, they were just a whole higgledy-piggledy mess of interesting things, kind of like the ones being recreated downstairs. But even so, they embody the assumption that Europeans, as members of a civilised culture, have the right to collect items belonging to other cultures for their own interest. These cabinets of curiosities developed into public institutions that we now know as museums, that serve the interest both of research and educating the public. And in order to do that, they developed these scientific classification systems. Even the museums themselves get classified in these classification systems. So you get museums of natural history, or museums of ethnology and anthropology, or museums of history, or science and industry. Or maybe you get one museum that has different galleries representing all these classifications. Of course, racism creeps in here, because different things get represented in different galleries. So that things that happened in the European past get represented in history, or if it's a more recent past, they get represented in science and industry. Things that happened in the non-European past or present get represented in ethnology. So Europeans have history, others have culture. Culture which kind of stays the same as it does in a display. It can get even worse than that. In the Cape Town Museum during the apartheid era, plaster casts of hunter-gathering people known as the San were actually displayed in the Natural History Gallery with the stuffed animals. Then the other cultures get displayed in the Ethnography Gallery upstairs, and then white culture gets displayed in history. We can't argue that that is racist. And racism creeps in to the kinds of thinking which develops out of these classification systems. it creeps in to the notion of progress, for instance. So you get this kind of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age classification system that famously developed from organising objects in museums. And with the assumption, obviously, Iron Age, or even modern, is kind of superior to Stone Age. Looking at things that way allows you to forget that, for instance, Papua New Guinea, a black society, because when contacted by whites in the 20th century was Stone Age, that allows us to forget that agriculture probably developed in Papua New Guinea at around the same time, if not before. It developed in the so-called Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, that's the precursor to European civilization. So by classifying things along one scale, you forget something else which might be much more important. Or you get the notion of evolution, which works very well when you look at the classification system of finches and Galapagos turtles and that kind of thing, but works less well when you start arranging people's cultural material products, hand axes, spears and things on a scale from simple to complex, and assuming that that represents simple to complex societies, which can be organised in some kind of similar hierarchy with the complex at the top as a kind of superior thing. The assumption that superior technology represents racial superiority. So, are museums racist? Well, they have been, and when they don't think about it, they can often continue to be. But I think, in a way, to ask that question is a bit like asking, is science racist? In some ways, yes. But to throw out the notion of the museum on the grounds of its racism would be like throwing out the notion of science on the grounds of its racism, throwing out the notion of evolution on the grounds of its racism, that it's racist. It'd be kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. What needs to happen is there needs to be a challenging of racist notions. As I said, racism doesn't need museums, but it's used them. So museums can equally be used to challenge racist notions. And that has happened in some museums, in many museums, and in museums in other parts of the world. I don't know how many of you have heard of the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, which has challenged the kind of racist past by offering a memory of the mixed race community as a kind of way of healing racial divisions in that nation. So I think there is spaces in museums where the kind of dialogue that we've been talking about here can happen, and where racism can get challenged. The racism is kind of there, but it's something that we can become aware of and we can challenge. As Zaid said, it's down to individuals, and as Sam has said, museums, these days at least, are often staffed by individuals who themselves aren't racist. But the answer is not for museums to decide what it is to not be racist. And Franklin's experience gives us a really good example of how difficult it is to not be racist, with all that kind of weight of tradition or weight of scientific thinking behind us. So what needs to happen, and hopefully is happening here tonight, is that museums need to open their doors and listen to the people that they have previously thought to speak for, or even worse, simply speak about.